Did the secret societies lose the inside track after the death of Roosevelt? Hardly. It is well known that his successor, Harry Truman, was a Mason. A portrait of Truman dressed in full Masonic garb is still displayed in Masonic lodges throughout the United States. Harry Truman said on a number of occasions in public that the greatest honor he had ever received was to have been named Grand Master of the Lodge. To think that a haberdasher from Missouri could have risen so meteorically without well-placed connections is naive at best. The Masonic forces catapulted him into prominence. When Roosevelt died unexpectedly, the former Missouri senator, now Vice President Harry S. Truman, was thrust into the limelight. In the eyes of the CFR, Truman was more than a bit unprepared for the job, but under watchful tutelage, he blossomed quickly and dependably. The same families and names. Just as we now have one national political party with two branches, we have a secret government divided into factions. The ruling faction includes the super rich, corporate and bank leaders, foundation heads, European aristocracy, and certain managers. These people generally belong to the TC, the Trilateral Commission, the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Bilderbergers. This secret government usually includes the elites of Europe and America, although in recent years, elites from other regions have joined the corporate groups. Author George Seldes said, quote, "If it is true that money prevails in national and state elections, then it must also be true that the men who put up the money, a handful including the DuPonts, Pews, Mellons, Rockefellers, and others, also control our political life, our Congress, and the presidency itself. A conspiracy of silence has always existed on this subject." Close quote. In the July 26, 1936 New York Times, Joseph Kennedy, father of future President John F. Kennedy, said, quote, "50 men run America, and that's a high figure," close quote. The second faction includes those in the national security state. While bankers and the corporate elite are slightly more captivated by money, the rogue military and intelligence groups are drawn more to power. The bankers and large corporations comprise the dominant force in control of the secret government. All recent CIA heads have been CFR members, as this continues to be a key spot to control. These factions form an extremely powerful special interest group determined to systematically destroy the Constitution and establish a one-world government. People in this group instigated World War I, World War II, and many other conflicts in this century. Remember, only a few people around Hitler really understood his plans, yet consider the destruction that resulted. It's a small cabal that's actually directing events. The third faction of the secret government contains the utopian dreamers, or the idealist liberals, who use slogans like "world peace through world law." Here are the scholars and think tank experts and many members of the WFA, the World Federalist Association. Some of these people understand that many will die to create a world government, but they accept this as a necessary transition stage. Some in this faction have deluded themselves into believing that this new society will help the people. This may be from a sense of superiority that they, as the elite, know what is best for the people, or from a belief that one world government will prevent war, promote peace, protect the environment, and raise the people's standard of living. History has shown that there are always some utopian dreamers who delude themselves into presenting a grandiose totalitarian scheme, such as communism, to improve or save humanity. It's a philosophy rooted in the heart, without knowledge of history, and with false compassion and false idealism. Karl Marx called these people useful idiots. The fourth faction of the secret government includes opportunists who don't really care what a new world order means, but they believe that joining groups like the CFR provides career advancement, prestige, contacts, and a means to earn more money. These members give the secret planners another layer of protection, and respectability. Many CFR members in the media are in this category. Carol Quigley describes the behind-the-scenes influence of bankers like the Morgans, Rothschilds, and Rockefellers. Quigley said there was an inner circle who directed things. No. Quigley said there was an inner circle who directed things partly by manipulating a larger outer circle through persuasion, patronage, and social pressure. C.B. Dall, D-A-L-L, the son-in-law of FDR, said, quote, Few members of the CFR know the long-range plans of its top management group, close quote. In the book FDR, My Exploited Father-in-Law, Dall said, quote, politics is the gentle art of having to pretend to be something that you know that you're not for vote-catching purposes while being aided by our press. Usually carefully screened leading actors are picked well in advance of Election Day by a small group, picked for both C.B. Dall, the son-in-law of FDR, said, quote, few members of the CFR know the long-range plans of its top management group, close quote. In the book FDR, My Exploited Father-in-Law, Dall said, quote, politics is the gentle art of having to pretend to be something that you know that you're not for vote-catching purposes while being aided by our press. Usually carefully screened leading actors are picked well in advance of Election Day by a small group, picked for both major parties, thereby reducing the promotional risk to just about zero. It is desirable for such a candidate to have great personal ambition and to be vulnerable to blackmail for some past occurrences, hence someone not apt to become too independent in time, but always amenable to suggestions on the policy level, close quote. Colonel House, the chief aide to Woodrow Wilson, knew that, along with great personal ambition, Wilson was vulnerable to blackmail. Dall and Wilson appointed Brandeis, Brandeis, to the Supreme Court because he was being blackmailed and couldn't obtain $250,000 to get back certain letters, close quote. While he was president, Eisenhower made a speech at a park Bernard Baruch had founded. He said, quote, 25 years ago as a young and unknown major, I took the wisest step in my life. I consulted Mr. Baruch, close quote. When the war started, Eisenhower was promoted over at least 150 senior officers to head the Allied effort in Europe. For many years, Baruch protected the interests of Wall Street in Washington. The real power has always been held by the bankers. Professor Quigley tells us that during the last part of the 19th century, the international bankers and their American counterparts moved into, quote, commercial banking and insurance on the one side and into railroad and heavy industry on the other side, close quote, and were able to mobilize enormous wealth and wield enormous economic, political, and social power. Popularly known as quote-unquote society, or quote-unquote the 400, they lived a life of dazzling splendor, sailing the ocean in great private yachts or traveling on land by private train. They moved in a ceremonious round between their spectacular estates and townhomes in Palm Beach, Long Island, the islands of Georgia, the Berkshires, Newport, and Bar Harbor, assembling from their fortress-like New York residences to attending the Metropolitan Opera under the critical eye of Mrs. Astor, or gathering for business meetings at the highest strategical level in the awesome presence of J.P. Morgan himself. The structure of financial controls created by the tycoons of big banking and big business were of extraordinary complexity. One business was built on another, and both were allied with semi-independent associates, the whole rearing upward into two pinnacles of economic and political power, of which one, centered in New York, was headed by J.P. Morgan and Company. The other, in Ohio, was headed by the Rockefeller family. When these two cooperated and they generally did. They could influence the economic life of the country to a large degree and could almost control its political life, at least on the federal level. For a couple of centuries prior to this time, the international bankers had reaped vast fortunes in Europe by financing the various nations in their wars against each other. History records that these nations were being plundered, pillaged, and bled dry by war debts to the bankers. The bankers seemed to win every time, no matter who was in power. With the advent of the Federal Reserve Bank and the income tax that came along with it at about the same time, the way was cleared for a siphon to be inserted into the pocketbooks of every American. I'm going to read that again. With the advent of the Federal Reserve Bank and the income tax that came along at about the exact same time, the way was cleared for a siphon to be inserted into the pocketbooks of every American, and for the vast resources of the American Republic to be manipulated and marshaled for the final thrust toward the accomplishment of their diabolical plan, world control. Many patriotic Americans recognized the grave dangers inherent in the Federal Reserve Bank. Conservative Henry Cabot Lodge said that it would make it possible for the bankers, quote, to submerge the gold standard in a flood of irredeemable paper currency, close quote. Charles A. Lindbergh Sr., the father of the famous aviator, stated, quote, the invisible government by the money power will create inflation whenever the trusts want inflation, close quote. The only way inflation can ever come into existence is to overprint paper currency. The only one that can do that is big government by borrowing for wrong purposes from the bankers to put too much paper money into circulation, chasing the same goods. The only two agencies that can cause inflation are the Federal Reserve System and the federal government in Washington, D.C. When the Federal Reserve came into existence, the national debt was $1 billion. Today it is over $5 trillion and growing. The issue is still control. Chapter 6, Entrenched in the System. Quote, research supports the hypothesis that visibility lends credibility to a position regardless what it is, close quote. That is C.E. Cortez. The establishment is now well entrenched, and few question their origin or authority. Over the decades, many heads of state and leaders of international organizations have visited CFR headquarters in New York. In 1990, Nelson Mandela visited the CFR, as did Yeltsin. Soon after, Jean-Bertrand Aristide of Haiti gave a speech at the CFR on September 25th, 1991. In 1995, when Castro visited New York, he promptly went to CFR headquarters to meet corporate leaders. In 1954, Senator Jenner said, quote, today the path to total dictatorship in the U.S. can be laid by strictly legal means, unseen and unheard by Congress, the president, or the people. We have a well-organized political action group in this country, determined to destroy our Constitution and establish a one-party state. The important point to remember about this group is not its ideology, but its organization. It is dynamic. It is a dynamic, aggressive elite forcing its way through every opening to make a breach for a collectivist one-party state. It operates secretly, silently, continuously to transform our government without suspecting that change is underway. If I seem to be extremist, the reason is that this revolutionary clique cannot be understood unless we accept the fact that they are extremist. It is difficult for people governed by reasonableness and morality to imagine the existence of a movement which ignores reasonableness and boasts of its determination to destroy, which ignores morality and boasts of its cleverness in outwitting its opponents by abandoning all scruples. This ruthless power-seeking elite is a disease of our century. This group is answerable neither to the president, the Congress, nor the courts. It is practically irremovable. Close quote. Over the decades, many in Congress have attacked the power of the secret government, but have had little success since Congress is temporal power for the individual, but corporations go on. In 1953 and 1954, the Reese Congressional Oversight Committee investigated the tax-exempt foundations and their relationship to left-wing groups. At the time, Congress said CFR, quote, productions are not objective, but are directed overwhelmingly at promoting the globalistic concept, close quote. The CFR had become, quote, in essence, an agency of the U.S. government, carrying its internationalist bias with it, close quote. However, little changed, and the investigation soon ended because the foundations were too powerful. These foundations worked together, supporting common goals like transforming education, supporting the UN, and supporting foreign aid to promote the New World Order. Ford Foundation Chairman John J. McCloy was also chairman of the Chase Manhattan Bank and the CFR. The Ford, Rockefeller, and Carnegie Foundations and others were established to restore the reputations of big bankers and large corporations that were criticized harshly before World Wars I and World War II. They also avoided paying taxes while taking others' money as they attained great power and influence. FDR's son, Elliot Roosevelt, wrote The Conservators, in which he declared, quote, there are within our world perhaps only a dozen organizations which shape the course of our various destinies as rigidly as the regularly constituted governments. The impact of their decisions. I'm going to read this whole thing again. FDR's son, Elliot Roosevelt, wrote The Conservators, in which he declared, quote, there are within our world perhaps only a dozen organizations which shape the courses of our various destinies as rigidly as the regularly constituted governments. The impact of their decisions reach into every home and office building in the modern world, close quote. These groups are the quote-unquote creme de la creme of global planners. Roosevelt proceeded to describe the elite groups discussed in the book. On August 23rd, 1993, Christopher Hitchens, the writer and Oxford friend of the Clintons, said on C-SPAN, quote, it is, of course, the case that there is a ruling class in this country and that it has allies internationally, close quote. On August 28th, 1994, Cokie Roberts said on ABC's This Week with David Brinkley, quote, global bankers are really running the world, close quote. President Abraham Lincoln said in his Gettysburg Address that this, quote, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth, close quote. In recent years, the CFR has grown to over 3,000 members. David Rockefeller was chairman of its board from 1970 to 1985, and Henry Kissinger has been an active, prominent member. The 1952 CFR annual report said its members sometimes suspend their membership when they join the government. And the Reese Congressional investigation said that there were secret CFR members. As suggested by the writings of its members, its goal is to condition the people to rely on government as the solution to all problems and to pull the country into one world government directed by UN dictates and policies. The CFR has dominated U.S. foreign policy and the State Department for decades through its publications, meetings, and private study groups. Joseph Kraft, a news columnist, in a July 1958 Harper's article, said its study groups played a key role in shaping the UN Charter. Weekly in the news, CFR experts discuss foreign affairs as guest experts. Recently, a CFR panel proposed ending a 19-year policy that prevented the press from working for the CIA. And this is probably what will happen. The CFR announces policy, and the U.S. government follows orders. The most powerful in this clique want to end national boundaries and racial and ethnic loyalties, supposedly to increase business and ensure world peace. What they strive for inevitably would inevitably lead to dictatorship and loss of freedoms by the people. The CFR was founded for the quote-unquote purpose of promoting disarmament and submergence of U.S. sovereignty and national independence into an all-powerful one-world government. This lust to surrender the sovereignty and independence of the U.S. is pervasive throughout most of the membership. The Bilderberger Group was founded in 1954 in Europe. According to Trilateral Commission, TC sources, its first meeting in 1954 was financed by the CIA. It has an annual meeting, and the Rothschilds play a major role in its affairs. In 1990, American Hegemony and the Trilateral Commission by Stephen Gill explained the activities of the TC and the Bilderbergers. Many members are in the European aristocracy, while American members are often also in the CFR. The Swiss Army guarded its 1995 meeting in Switzerland, which is strange for a private organization. The ultimate implication of this is that all power would be centralized in a single global authority. National identities and boundaries would be eliminated. The CFR always suggests measures that would serve as stepping stones to world government. The CFR promotes the best defense against communism to be a new world order, a stronger United Nations, regional alliances such as NATO, and other building blocks of world government. Richard Nixon. Let's take a look back at the rise and fall of Richard Nixon. There is no doubt that Rockefeller and others catapulted him into prominence. His views flip-flopped and nobody took notice. Harvard historian and economist John Kenneth Galbraith gleefully noted President Nixon's tilt to the left in an article in September 1970 in New York Magazine, an article entitled Richard Nixon and the Great Socialist Revival. Galbraith wrote that after gaining the presidency, Richard Nixon surrounded himself not with leading conservatives, but with some of the leading socialist scholars of the day who wasted no time in pushing the nation toward the left. Galbraith observed, quote, certainly the least predicted development under the Nixon administration was this great new thrust to socialism. One encounters people who still aren't aware of it. Others must be rubbing their eyes, for certainly the portents seemed all to the contrary. As an opponent of socialism, Mr. Nixon seemed steadfast, close quote. In February 1968, Richard Nixon announced that he would run for president. What few people realized was that Nixon had spent the previous 6 years working for the law firm of John Mitchell, Nelson Rockefeller's personal attorney. In 1960, Nixon suffered a narrow defeat in the presidential race against John F. Kennedy. He then ran for governor of California in 1962 at the request of Norman Rockefeller and disappeared into what most political observers thought would be political oblivion when he was defeated by Pat Brown. Supposedly, Nixon was broke, both economically and politically, but a remarkable rehabilitation began to take place. Researcher Gary Allen noted, quote, when Nixon left Washington, he, by his own claim, had little more than an Oldsmobile, Pat's respectable Republican cloth coat, and a government pension. While in law practice, Nixon had an income of $200,000 per year. By 1968, he reported his net worth as $515,830. During those years, Nixon lived in a posh $100,000 a year Manhattan apartment owned by Nelson Rockefeller. And what did Nixon do from 1962 to 1968 to earn $200,000 a year salary? He, quote, spent most of his time touring the country and the world, first rebuilding his political reputation and then campaigning to get the 1968 Republican nomination, close quote. In 1968, Nixon campaigned as the arch enemy of communism. Yet after the elections, his actions quickly boggled the minds of most conservatives. Gary Allen wrote in 1971, quote, "The Nixon game plan is infinitely more clever and dangerous than those of his predecessors because it masquerades as being the opposite of what it is," close quote. Even during his campaign, Nixon began proclaiming that if elected, he would pursue a program which he termed, quote-unquote, New Internationalism. New Internationalism turned out to be a euphemism for the disastrous trade policy with the Soviet Union, also known as détente, the likes of which had not been seen since President Franklin Roosevelt's Lend-Lease policy of the early 1940s, which rebuilt the Soviet war machine into the dominant force that it is today. This new internationalism was merely a prelude to the real goal of the secret societies, which they call the New World Order, or even New Atlantis. After Nixon was elected, his former boss, John Mitchell, took over as Attorney General. Nixon also appointed Dr. Henry Kissinger, another Rockefeller confidant, as his national security advisor. Kissinger was Rockefeller's personal advisor on foreign affairs and a paid staff member of the Council on Foreign Relations. The Nixon team quickly moved to establish the most pro-Soviet program in the United States. The Nixon team quickly moved to establish the most pro-Soviet program the United States had seen in 25 years. Nixon's sweeping turn to the left astonished outgoing President Lyndon Johnson. In a December 1st, 1971 article in the now defunct Washington Star, Johnson said, quote, Can't you see the uproar? If I had been responsible for Taiwan getting kicked out of the United Nations, or if I had imposed sweeping national controls on prices and wages, Nixon has gotten by with it," close quote. Columnist Stuart Alsop, A-L-S-O-P, certainly agreed, quote, "There is a sort of unconscious conspiracy between the president and his natural enemies, the liberal Democrats, to conceal the extent to which his basic program is really the liberal democratic program," close quote. Syndicated columnist James Reston, writing on February 3rd, 1971, was surprised at Nixon's leftist economic approach. Quote, "The Nixon budget is so complex, so unlike the Nixon of the past, so un-Republican that it defies rational analysis. The Nixon budget is more planned, has more welfare in it, and has a bigger predicted deficit than any other budget of this century," close quote. Source of power. Nixon, like Truman, was not part of the CFR insider crowd at the start of his political life. But like Eisenhower and George Marshall before him, he too enjoyed a meteoric rise to power. He went from a socially awkward small-town lawyer in 1946 to vice president-elect of the United States in 1952. High friends in high places don't hurt a career. Nixon was propelled into a California congressional seat when the 10-year Democratic incumbent George Voorhis had the courage to introduce a bill calling for the elimination of the Federal Reserve System and then denounced deficit spending in his book, Out of Debt, Out of Danger. According to Voorhis, Voorhis, in October 1945, a representative for a large New York financial house flew to California to help assemble support for Nixon. Voorhis was vilified by this emissary as, quote, "one of the most dangerous men in Washington," close quote, thanks to his stand on the Federal Reserve Bank and deficit spending. Every person in modern history who has exposed the true purpose of the Federal Reserve Bank has gone down in defeat or death. President John F. Kennedy began printing U.S. Federal Reserve notes backed by the U.S. government, not the privately owned Federal Reserve of today. Most historians feel that this is the real reason for his death. Political views are one thing, messing with the till of powerful people is another. Abraham Lincoln was clear about his views of a private central bank and met the same end as Kennedy. Nixon won the congressional seat in 1946. In 1947, he introduced a remarkable piece of legislation which called for the United Nations to be able to enact, interpret, and enforce world law to prevent war. In 1961, after losing the presidential race to John Kennedy, Nixon joined the Council on Foreign Relations. Nixon joined the CFR. He dropped his membership in 1965 to run for governor of California against Pat Brown when that membership became a hot political issue in the race. After losing this race, most observers mistakenly thought Richard Nixon was washed up, but not so. He moved in next door to Nelson Rockefeller in his apartment building at 810 Fifth Avenue in New York. Nixon took a prestigious job in a law firm working under Rockefeller's personal attorney, John Mitchell. In 1967, the CFR signaled that Nixon had its support in the upcoming 1968 elections by allowing him to publish an article in the October 1967 edition of its journal Foreign Affairs. Nixon wrote that after Vietnam, Asia needed to, quote-unquote, evolve regional approaches to the evolution of a new world order. Syndicated columnist Roscoe Drummond noted in 1969, quote, the most significant political fact of the hour is now so evident it can't be seriously disputed. Richard M. Nixon is a secret liberal, close quote. Once elected, Nixon set a new record, appointing 110 CFR members to government posts. In addition, he appointed Henry Kissinger, the council's most influential member, as his national security advisor. As Nelson Rockefeller said, he was the smartest guy available. By 1970, Kissinger stood accused of having been a Soviet agent by the highest-ranking Polish agent ever to defect to the West, Michał Golenewski, Golenewski. The CIA was made aware of these charges by British counterintelligence, but CIA counterintelligence chief James Jesus Angleton never pursued the accusations and even tried to discredit Golenewski as not being a genuine defector. Angleton later died mysteriously in a boating accident. Some believe, however, that he merely faked his death and actually defected to the Soviet Union. In their 1989 book, Windows, William R. Corson, Susan B. Trento, and Joseph J. Trento claimed, quote, no follow-up investigation of Kissinger was done. Angleton discredited the Golenewski report with the FBI. No one seemed willing to order an investigation into the president's national security advisor at a time when Kissinger seemed to be gaining Nixon's total confidence, close quote. In 1977, the most important American mole inside the Soviet government had been compromised, and CIA counterintelligence expert Leonard V. McCoy was assigned the task of investigating it by CIA Director Admiral Stansfield Turner. During this investigation, McCoy, the number 2 man in the CIA counterintelligence, discovered that Henry Kissinger, then out of government, had been advising Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin on how to deal with the new Carter administration in the ongoing SALT negotiations. McCoy was shocked, quote, the idea that a former Secretary of State and National Security Advisor would meet alone as a private citizen with the Soviet ambassador to discuss negotiating techniques seemed beyond belief to McCoy, close quote. He later revealed to CIA analyst David S. Sullivan that the only way to describe Kissinger's action was treason. McCoy's report to Admiral Turner was sent on to the White House. For his efforts, McCoy was dragged in front of Admiral Turner and his deputy, Frank Carlucci. He was summarily reduced one civil service grade, effectively putting an end to his CIA career. Carlucci, who was later to become Secretary of Defense under President Reagan, is widely considered by professionals in the field to be nothing more than a consummate bureaucrat, and therefore a poor choice for any defense or intelligence role. But then again, it's not about competence. Anthony Sutton is a scholar who started asking questions many others were unwilling to ask before him. I'm going to say that again. Anthony Sutton is a scholar who started asking questions many others were unwilling to ask before him. The data he uncovered supported a vast network that seemed to have its finger in the pie of many of the world events that worked against the interests of the United States. He asked, quote, why had the United States built up its enemy? Why had we built up the Soviet Union? Why were we transferring technology to Hitler's Germany? Why does Washington want to conceal these facts? These questions led to him writing America's Secret Establishment, Wall Street and FDR. These questions led to his writing America's Secret Establishment, Wall Street and FDR. What the hell? This is two separate books, I think. These questions led to him writing America's Secret Establishment, Wall Street, and FDR, The Rise of Hitler, the Bolshevik Revolution, and about 22 other books on similar subjects. Noted Harvard professor and historian Richard Pipes, in his book Survival is Not Enough, Soviet Realities and America's Future, called Sutton's views, quote, extreme and uncomfortable for many businessmen and economists, but for this reason, his work is either dismissed or more often simply ignored, close quote. Sutton is the first to admit that his views are not accepted by the American Historical Association and that he has paid dearly for these views from a professional standpoint. Once a scholar at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, Sutton has been relegated to obscurity for ruffling the feathers of the academic establishment. As with all other worlds, the core of professions is a small circle. As with all worlds, the core of professions is a small circle that expects its members to fall in line with the status quo. People like William Buckley called him a jerk, and Glenn Campbell, former director of the Hoover Institution, has called Sutton a problem. But Sutton likes to say, quote, judge a man by his enemies, close quote. Sutton contends that the data strongly supports his view that history for the 20th century needs to be rewritten. Sutton's views conform to those of Professor Carroll Quigley, who had written on the subject in the 1960s. Sutton feels strongly that if someone were to explore the volumes written by John Dewey, a devoted follower of Hegel's theories, who believed the state is supreme and the individual is merely a pawn to be trained, he would agree that they were the basis for our educational system. It was largely the work of Skull and Bones that brought this educational system into mainstream thinking. When asked what Sutton sees for the future, he adds, quote, chaos and confusion, and ultimately a battle between the individual and the state, close quote. Unfortunately, he feels the individual, ultimately, he feels the individual is stronger and will win. The Trilateral Commission, reaching for the stars. The membership of the Trilateral Commission is composed of 325 leaders of the world's three economic superpowers: North America, Western Europe, and Japan, hence the term trilateral. The Commission meets twice yearly to encourage their economic interdependence. The membership of the Trilateral Commission is composed of 325 leaders of the world's three economic superpowers: North America, Western Europe, and Japan, hence the term trilateral. This commission meets twice yearly to encourage their economic interdependence. Many private organizations link the Trilateral Commission to form what is known as the Eastern Liberal Establishment. At the center of insider power, influence, and planning, the CFR holds the Eastern Liberal Establishment together. Furthermore, its avowed aim is to abolish nationalism in exchange for globalism. Along these lines, CFR member and trilateralist Richard Gardner has called for, quote-unquote, piece by piece erosion of national sovereignty in bringing forth the, quote-unquote, House of World Order. Not surprisingly, most of the Commission's important French participants belong to the Grand Orient Lodge of Freemasonry, and its largest contributor is the Ford Foundation. General Electric, General Motors, and Xerox are also among its supporters and multinationalists. The Commission's founding director, Zbigniew Brzezinski, drafted its charter. His philosophy continues to dominate the Trilateral Commission, as well as the executive branch of the U.S. government. Yet he praised Marxism and favored occult writings of the French Jesuit priest Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. In the book Between Two Ages, Brzezinski gave form to the coming, quote-unquote, technotronic era, reflective of the school-to-work system entrenched in today's education reform. Four thrusts of the Commission's triangle papers are: number one, a renovated world monetary system; number two, redistribution of the world's wealth; number three, stepped up trade with communists; and number four, greater international controls. In uniting Japan, Canada, and the U.S., and the Central Europe, in uniting Japan, Canada, and the U.S. One more time. Wish I could edit this. In uniting Japan, Canada, the U.S., and the European community, the Commission underwrites one world government whose eco-socialism promises to supplant sovereignty of nation states with that of corporations. Authorities agree that together, the Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR, the Trilateral Commission, TC, virtually runs our government. The Trilateral Commission was established in 1973 by David Rockefeller after he read Zbigniew Brzezinski's Between Two Ages, which praised socialism and said the U.S. is becoming obsolete, so we should join a one world government. National sovereignty was no longer a viable concept. The U.S. Constitution should be rewritten, and the existing federal system of having sovereign states was no longer necessary. He called for an alliance among North America, Western Europe, Japan, and ultimately the communist countries. He said, quote, Marxism represents a further vital and creative stage in the maturing of man's universal vision. Though Stalinism may have been a needless tragedy for both the Russian people and communism as an ideal, there is the intellectually tantalizing possibility that for the world at large, it was a blessing in disguise, close quote. These were strange words for a man who became President Carter's national security advisor. However, this was magic to David Rockefeller. He hired Brzezinski to direct the Trilateral Commission and brought in Carter as well. Rockefeller in 1972 made the remarkable statement, quote, "The social experiment in China under Chairman Mao's leadership is one of the most important and successful in human history," close quote. Over 60 million Chinese died in Mao's experiment. The Trilateral Commission, based in New York City, has several hundred members from Western Europe, Japan, Canada, and the United States, with a goal of fostering closer cooperation among these regions to establish a global government. The policymakers.